London, 1854. The Hatchards' bookshop on Piccadilly bustled with the elite of London society, but Flora Middleton stood apart in her plain grey dress, fingertips brushing leather-bound spines with reverence others reserved for jewels. At 23, she moved like a ghost among the chattering patrons, her slight figure and unremarkable features rendering her nearly invisible, precisely as she preferred. "Miss Middleton!" The sharp voice of Lady Harwick cut through the murmured conversations. "Do stop dawdling. My daughters require your attention." Flora's shoulders tensed, but she turned with practiced composure. "Of course, my lady." As companion to the Harwick girls, Flora had grown accustomed to such public reprimands. She placed the book she'd been admiring back on the shelf and moved toward her charges, two golden-haired beauties who giggled behind gloved hands. "I swear, Miss Middleton, you'd vanish entirely into those books if permitted," Lady Harwick sniffed. "A quality that hardly recommends you for proper society. Girls must be vivacious to secure advantageous matches." "Indeed, Lady Harwick." Flora's voice was soft but clear, her eyes downcast. "Mamma, look who's just arrived." Cecilia Harwick, the elder daughter, clutched her sister's arm. "It's the Duke of Selborne." The shop fell into a hush as a tall figure entered. Even Flora found her gaze drawn to the doorway. The Duke of Selborne, Maxwell Selborne, stood framed by the morning light, his severe features set in what society had come to recognize as his perpetual frown. His dark hair and impeccable attire contrasted with the pallor of his complexion, suggesting a man who preferred shadows to sunlight. "How thrilling," Lady Harwick whispered, smoothing her skirts. "His Grace rarely makes social appearances since the tragedy." Flora knew the whispers. The Duke's betrothed had jilted him 3 years prior, fleeing to the continent with another man on the eve of their wedding. Since then, he had become London's most notorious recluse, emerging only for Parliament and essential business. As the Duke moved through the shop, conversation resumed in hushed tones. Flora returned her attention to the Harwick girls, guiding them toward the poetry section as instructed. She did not notice the Duke's gaze following her movements, nor the curious arch of his brow. Later that afternoon, the Harwick carriage joined the procession along Hyde Park for the fashionable hour. Flora sat opposite her charges, her back straight despite the uncomfortable bench designated for companions and governesses. Did you see how the Duke hardly acknowledged anyone? Lydia Harwick, the younger daughter, leaned toward her sister. "They say he's become quite savage in his solitude." "I heard from Lady Pembroke that he's seeking a wife," Cecilia replied. "A business arrangement only." "Can you imagine? After such a scandal, perhaps he's wise not to risk his heart again." "Girls," Lady Harwick admonished, though her expression betrayed her interest. "Such speculation is unbecoming. Though I dare say any family would be fortunate to align with Selborne, despite his eccentricities." Flora kept her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though her mind wandered to the lonely figure she had glimpsed at Hatchards. There was something in his countenance beyond mere arrogance, a guardedness that seemed familiar to her own carefully constructed walls. The carriage slowed as they approached the Serpentine, where riders and walkers converged. Suddenly, Lady Harwick straightened. "The Duke rides alone," she murmured. "How fortunate we should encounter him twice in one day." Indeed, the Duke of Selborne approached on a magnificent black stallion, his tall figure commanding attention despite his evident desire to avoid it. As he drew near their carriage, Lady Harwick instructed her coachman to pause, creating an opportunity for acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she called, with a practised smile. "What a pleasure to see you enjoying the fine weather." The Duke reined his horse beside their carriage, removing his hat with reluctant courtesy. "Lady Harwick." "Miss Harwick." "Miss Lydia." His deep voice carried little warmth, Yet Flora noted a hint of resignation rather than true disdain. "May I present Miss Middleton, companion to my daughters?" Lady Harwick gestured toward Flora with dismissive haste. The Duke's dark eye shifted to Flora, who offered a polite nod without meeting his gaze directly. "Miss Middleton." Something in his tone caused Flora to look up, and for a moment, their eyes met. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice barely audible above the park's ambient noise. A curious silence fell, broken only when Lady Harwick began to inquire after the Duke's aunt, a connection she never failed to emphasize in his presence. Flora returned her attention to her folded hands, though she could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze lingering upon her. When the carriage eventually continued on its way, Lady Harwick was practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you note how he looked at Cecilia? Perhaps the rumors of his search for a duchess are not unfounded after all." Flora remained silent, knowing any observation would be unwelcome. Yet she had seen where the Duke's attention had truly fallen, and it had not been upon the beautiful Cecilia Harwick. That evening, as Flora helped the girls prepare for a musical soiree, Cecilia dismissed her maid to speak privately. "Miss Middleton, you must advise me," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "How does one capture the interest of a man who seems determined to remain disinterested?" Flora paused in arranging Cecilia's wrap. "I hardly think I'm qualified to advise on such matters, Miss Cecilia." "Nonsense. You observe everything." Cecilia turned from the mirror. "That's why Mamma hired you, despite your reserved nature. You see what others miss." The words, though not unkind, reminded Flora of her position, valued for her discretion and invisible service rather than her company. She smoothed the silk wrap with careful hands. "Perhaps authenticity would serve you better than artifice, Miss Cecilia. The Duke seems a man who would value honesty above practiced charm." Cecilia considered this with surprise. "How curiously insightful, Miss Middleton. You speak as though you know him." "I merely observe, as you said." Flora stepped back, her duty complete. "Enjoy your evening." Later, alone in her small bedchamber beneath the eaves, Flora removed the pins from her hair and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had learned years ago that quiet girls with no fortune and questionable family connections survived by becoming indispensable while remaining unnoticed. Her father's disgrace and subsequent death had taught her the precariousness of reputation, and her mother's decline into melancholy had shown her the danger of misplaced trust. Yet something about the Duke's guarded expression had stirred a recognition within her, the look of someone who had built similar walls against the world's judgment. The following Tuesday found Flora accompanying Lady Harwick to the circulating library, the girls having been invited to a luncheon where companions were deemed unnecessary. As Lady Harwick conversed with acquaintances near the entrance, Flora was granted a precious half-hour to browse the shelves in peace. She had just selected a volume of natural philosophy when a deep voice beside her broke her concentration. An unusual choice for a lady's companion. Flora nearly dropped the book, turning to find the Duke of Selborne standing mere feet away, his tall frame casting her in shadow. "Your Grace." She curtsied, her heart racing at the unexpected encounter. "I find natural sciences most illuminating, though I understand they're not considered suitable drawing-room topics for young ladies." The faintest smile touched the Duke's stern mouth. "Hence why you select them only when your charges are elsewhere." Heat rose to Flora's cheeks. "I believe in being prepared for any educational inquiry, Your Grace." "Of course." His tone suggested he recognized the polite fiction but chose not to challenge it. "And what educational inquiries do the Misses Harwick typically pose?" "The optimal depth of a curtsy?" "The correct number of flowers to include in a bouquet?" The unexpected touch of irony surprised a smile from Flora. "You underestimate them, Your Grace." Miss Cecilia has a genuine interest in Italian poetry, and Miss Lydia shows promise in watercolors. But neither, I suspect, shares your interest in. He glanced at the volume in her hands. Geological formations of the British Isles. Few do, she admitted. The Duke regarded her with undisguised curiosity. You speak frankly, Miss Middleton. Forgive me if I've given offence. On the contrary. He selected a book from a nearby shelf, seemingly at random. Frankness is a rare commodity in our circles. Almost as rare as an appreciation for sedimentary rock formations. Before Flora could respond, Lady Harwick's voice rang out across the library. Miss Middleton. We must depart immediately. Flora closed the book with reluctance. Excuse me, Your Grace. As she moved to return the volume to its shelf, the Duke stopped her with a slight gesture. Allow me to borrow this for you. I shall have it delivered to Harwick House when I've finished my own perusal. Confusion clouded her features. That's most unnecessary, Your Grace. Indulge me, Miss Middleton. Consider it an experiment in educational preparedness. She hesitated only briefly before curtsying again. As you wish, Your Grace. Lady Harwick was practically incandescent as they left the library. The Duke, conversing with you. What did he say? Was he inquiring after Cecilia? No, my lady. He merely commented on my choice of reading material. Lady Harwick's enthusiasm dimmed. How very odd. Well, no matter. Lord and Lady Pembroke's ball is in a fortnight, and I've received confirmation the Duke will attend. Cecilia shall wear the blue silk. 3 days later, a package arrived at Harwick House addressed to Miss Flora Middleton. Inside was the geology text from the library, alongside a note in a strong, masculine hand. Miss Middleton, having examined this volume thoroughly, I find it woefully inadequate on the subject of Derbyshire limestone. If you would permit a correction to this educational deficiency, my carriage shall call for you at 2 o'clock tomorrow, weather permitting. Lady Selborne, my aunt, will accompany us to the British Museum's newly installed geological collection. Selborne. Flora stared at the note in disbelief, certain there must be some mistake. Yet the Duke's seal and hand were unmistakable. She carefully folded the note, her mind racing. Such an invitation was unprecedented, and accepting it would certainly draw Lady Harwick's attention and likely her displeasure. Yet the thought of refusing made her heart sink with unexpected disappointment. When she sought out Lady Harwick to request permission, the lady's reaction surprised her. The Duke wishes your company. Lady Harwick repeated, her brow furrowed. For what possible purpose? Flora presented the note. It appears to be an educational outing, my lady. With his aunt as chaperone. Lady Harwick studied the note, suspicion gradually giving way to calculation. How extraordinary. Yet who am I to question a duke's whims? You shall go, Miss Middleton. Thank you, my lady. And you shall observe everything, his conversation, his manner, his interests. Such information may prove valuable in guiding Cecilia's approach. Lady Harwick's eyes narrowed. You understand your purpose in this? Flora nodded, though a small voice within her protested being used as an instrument of matchmaking intelligence. Yes, my lady. The following afternoon, the Duke's carriage arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Flora, dressed in her best grey walking dress, still plain but neatly pressed, was ushered into the elegant convent where an elderly lady with bright, observant eyes awaited. Miss Middleton, I presume. The lady extended a gloved hand. I am Lady Selborne, Maxwell's aunt and occasional keeper. My aunt exaggerates her responsibilities, the Duke remarked as he entered the carriage after Flora. "Good afternoon, Miss Middleton." The close quarters of the carriage made Flora acutely aware of the Duke's presence opposite her. "Your Grace, Lady Selborne." "This is most kind." Lady Selborne waved away the formality. "Nonsense. My nephew rarely expresses interest in anything beyond his estates and parliamentary duties these days. When he mentioned a companion with geological interests, I insisted on facilitating the introduction properly. Aunt Helena has appointed herself guardian of my social rehabilitation," the Duke explained with dry humour. "Someone must," Lady Selborne retorted. 3 years of seclusion is quite enough, Maxwell." As the carriage moved through London streets, Flora found herself drawn into conversation about the recent geological discoveries in the north. To her surprise, both the Duke and his aunt were knowledgeable and engaged, asking her opinions and listening with genuine interest. At the museum, the Duke offered his arm with formal courtesy. Flora hesitated before placing her gloved hand lightly upon his sleeve, aware of the curious glances they attracted, the stern Duke, his elderly aunt, and a plain, unknown young woman in modest attire. "You must forgive the attention," Lady Selborne murmured as they entered. "My nephew causes a stir whenever he emerges from his self-imposed exile." "I'm accustomed to being invisible, my lady," Flora replied with a small smile. "It's rather novel to be noticed, even by reflection." The Duke glanced down at her. "Is that your preference, Miss Middleton?" "Invisibility." She considered the question seriously. "It has been safer, in my experience." Something in her tone caused both Selbans to look at her with renewed interest, but neither pressed for elaboration as they turned their attention to the exhibitions. The afternoon passed in a haze of discovery and surprisingly easy conversation. The Duke revealed himself to be both knowledgeable and, when relaxed, capable of dry wit that frequently made Flora smile despite her usual reserve. Lady Selborne watched their interaction with keen eyes, occasionally steering the conversation toward personal matters. "And your family, Miss Middleton? Are they in London?" Flora's smile faded slightly. "My mother lives in modest circumstances in Bath, my lady. My father passed some years ago." "I'm sorry to hear it," Lady Selborne said gently. "Was it sudden?" Flora focused on a display of quartz formations. "In a manner of speaking. There was a scandal involving misappropriated funds. He took his own life rather than face the consequences." She had never spoken so plainly about her family's disgrace and immediately regretted the impulse toward honesty. Yet neither the Duke nor his aunt showed the expected recoil of horror. "How difficult for you," Lady Selborne said simply. "And how young you must have been." 17, Flora confirmed. "Old enough to understand everything we lost, position, security, respect, but young enough to still feel the injustice keenly." The Duke had gone very still beside her. "And that is when you learned the value of invisibility." It wasn't a question, but Flora nodded. "Lady Harwick knew my mother before everything. She offered the position out of old loyalty, with the understanding that discretion and usefulness would compensate for my tainted connection." "How charitable," the Duke remarked, his tone making the word sound anything but complimentary. As the afternoon drew to a close, Lady Selborne declared herself fatigued and suggested the Duke escort Flora through the final exhibition while she rested on a nearby bench. Though Flora protested the impropriety, the older woman waved away her concerns. "You are in a public museum, my dear, not a secluded garden. And despite his fearsome reputation, my nephew is a gentleman." Left alone with the Duke, Flora found herself suddenly tongue-tied, the ease of their previous conversation evaporating in Lady Selborne's absence. "My aunt is not as subtle as she believes herself to be," the Duke said after a moment of awkward silence. "I don't understand, Your Grace." He gestured toward a less crowded corner of the exhibition. She has been attempting to reintroduce me to society for 3 years. This is merely her latest strategy, creating the appearance of a shared intellectual interest to lure me from isolation. Flora felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. I see. Then I've been an unwitting accomplice in your aunt's scheme. I apologize for imposing on your time. You misunderstand me, Miss Middleton. The Duke's voice softened unexpectedly. My aunt arranged this meeting, yes, but she did not fabricate my interest in your conversation. That, I assure you, is entirely genuine. Flora looked up, searching his expression for signs of mockery or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity in his dark eyes. Why? The question escaped before she could prevent it. Because you do not perform. He spoke quietly, for her ears alone. Everyone in society wears a mask, Miss Middleton. Some better crafted than others, but masks nonetheless. You have built walls rather than donned a mask. I find I prefer the honesty of walls to the deception of performances. The insight struck her like a physical blow. You speak from experience, Your Grace. Maxwell, he corrected, then looked surprised at his own informality. When we discuss matters of walls and masks, perhaps we might dispense with some of the artifice ourselves. I couldn't possibly, when we are alone, then, he amended. In public, propriety shall reign supreme, I assure you. Flora felt unmoored, adrift in unfamiliar waters. This is most irregular, Your Grace. So everyone continually reminds me. A shadow crossed his features. After Eliza's betrayal, I found I had little patience left for society's expectations. 3 years of avoiding ballrooms and morning calls has done nothing to improve my temperament in that regard. Flora's heart ached for the pain evident in his voice. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? His tone sharpened. Most people were merely sorry to lose such excellent gossip when I withdrew from society. The jilted Duke left waiting at the altar while his bride fled to Italy with her music master. I provided entertainment for months. People can be cruel when they forget that titles and fortunes do not render one immune to suffering, Flora said softly. The Duke studied her face for a long moment. You are a most unusual woman, Miss Middleton. Flora, she offered, feeling strangely brave. If we are dispensing with artifice. His smile transformed his severe features, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before disillusionment hardened him. Flora. Like the Roman goddess of flowers. My mother had romantic notions, she explained with a small shrug. Before disappointment tempered her expectations. And has disappointment similarly tempered yours? The question hung between them, intimate and challenging. Before she could formulate a response, Lady Selborne rejoined them, bringing their private conversation to an end. As the Duke's carriage returned her to Harwick House, Flora felt as though she had awakened from a dream. The afternoon had been so far removed from her daily existence that it seemed almost imaginary now. I hope we shall see you again, Miss Middleton, Lady Selborne said warmly as they parted. Perhaps at the Pembroke Ball next week? I understand the Harwicks will be in attendance. Yes, my lady. Though I shall be there merely as companion to the Misses Harwick. Nevertheless, the Duke interjected, I should be pleased to continue our discussion of Derbyshire limestone formations. His formal words were belied by the warmth in his eyes, leaving Flora thoroughly confused as she ascended the steps to Harwick House. Lady Harwick was waiting in the drawing-room, eager for information. Well? What did you observe? Did he speak of Cecilia? Flora hesitated. The Duke did not mention Miss Cecilia, my lady. The conversation centered primarily on geological matters and museum exhibitions. Lady Harwick's expression soured. How tiresome. Did he seem amenable to introduction at the Pembroke ball, at least? He did mention he would be attending, my lady. Excellent. Lady Harwick tapped her fingers against the armrest. Cecilia shall wear the diamond hairpins. They catch the light so beautifully when she dances. In the week leading to the Pembroke ball, Flora found herself unable to concentrate on her duties. The Duke's words echoed in her mind, and she caught herself looking for his tall figure whenever they ventured into public spaces. On the night of the ball, she took extra care with her appearance, though her best evening gown remained a simple affair of dove-grey silk that had belonged to her mother in better days, altered to fit her smaller frame. "You look almost pretty tonight, Miss Middleton," Lydia remarked as they prepared to depart. "Is there someone at the ball you hope to impress?" "Don't be ridiculous, Lydia," Cecilia scoffed, admiring her reflection in the mirror. "Who would Miss Middleton know at a ball? She'll be sitting with the dowagers and chaperones all evening." Flora said nothing, accepting Cecilia's dismissal with practiced grace, though it stung more sharply than usual. The Pembroke ballroom blazed with candlelight, the cream of London society swirling in a kaleidoscope of jewels and finery. Flora helped settle the Harwick ladies before retreating to the row of chairs reserved for companions and elderly relations. She had been seated less than 10 minutes when a murmur ran through the crowd. The Duke of Selborne had arrived, his commanding presence causing heads to turn despite, or perhaps because of, his notorious reclusiveness. Lady Harwick immediately signalled Cecilia, positioning her advantageously as the Duke made his obligatory greeting to their hosts. Flora watched the familiar choreography with a strange hollowness in her chest. To her surprise, after completing the expected social rituals, the Duke began making his way toward the chaperone's corner. Conversations hushed as he approached, speculation evident in every curious gaze. He stopped directly before Flora's chair and bowed formally. "Miss Middleton, you look well this evening." A ripple of whispers spread through the nearby observers. Flora rose and curtsied, acutely aware of Lady Harwick's stunned expression nearby. "Your Grace, it's kind of you to acknowledge me. Would you do me the honor of this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. The whispers escalated to a near-audible buzz. Flora stared at his offered hand in disbelief. That is." She glanced helplessly toward Lady Harwick, whose face had transformed from shock to calculation. "Go ahead, Miss Middleton," Lady Harwick called, her voice carrying clearly. "His Grace honours us all with his attention to our household." Tentatively, Flora placed her hand in the Duke's and allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. As they took their positions, she could feel hundreds of eyes upon them. "You've created quite a stir, Your Grace," she murmured as the music began. "Maxwell," he corrected quietly. "And causing a stir was precisely my intention." They moved through the steps of the quadrille, Flora grateful for the formal nature of the dance that required little close contact. "May I ask why you would deliberately court scandal?" she ventured when they came together again in the pattern. "Is it scandalous to dance with an intelligent woman who appreciates geological formations?" His lips twitched with suppressed humour. "You know very well it is when that woman is a paid companion with a disgraced family name, and her dance partner is one of England's most eligible dukes." His expression sobered. Perhaps it's time society reconsidered its arbitrary distinctions. A noble sentiment, but hardly realistic. Flora executed a turn, then continued when they rejoined. "Lady Harwick believes you're using me to gain information about Miss Cecilia." The Duke's brow furrowed. "The elder Harwick girl? What possible information could I desire?" "She's considered one of this season's beauties, and you're rumoured to be seeking a duchess." Flora kept her tone light despite the tightness in her chest. "Lady Harwick has expectations." Lady Harwick shall be disappointed, then. His hand tightened slightly on hers as they completed the final steps. I have no interest in Miss Harwick, beautiful though she may be. As the music concluded, the Duke led Flora not back to the chaperone's corner but toward a less crowded area near the terrace doors. You must return me to my place, Flora insisted. People are watching. Let them watch. Despite his defiant words, he guided her to a settee visible from the main ballroom but offering a degree of privacy. I've spent 3 years as an object of gossip. I find I no longer care for society's opinions. Some of us don't have that luxury, Flora reminded him, though she sat when he gestured to the settee. The Duke remained standing, his tall figure effectively shielding her from some of the curious gazes. What if you could have that luxury, Flora? She stilled, his use of her given name and the impossible implication of his words rendering her momentarily speechless. I don't understand. He sat beside her, maintaining a proper distance while leaning slightly forward. I told you once that I preferred walls to masks. In the week since we met, I found myself thinking of little else but the quiet strength it must have taken to build those walls, and how much more I admire that strength than the practiced charm of a dozen débutantes. Flora's heart hammered against her ribs. Your Grace, Maxwell, you cannot mean I do. His voice was low but certain. I know it seems sudden, perhaps even mad. Society will certainly think so. But I've spent 3 years in isolation, afraid to trust after betrayal. Something about your quiet dignity speaks to me in a way I hadn't thought possible again. You hardly know me, Flora protested, though her voice trembled. I know enough. He glanced across the ballroom where eager mothers positioned their daughters advantageously. I know you face disgrace with dignity. I know you value knowledge above gossip. I know your smile, rare as it is, transforms your entire countenance. His gaze returned to her face. Most importantly, I know you see me and not the Duke, not the fortune, not the title, but the man beneath. Flora struggled to organize her thoughts. This is impossible. Lady Harwick would never permit it. Lady Harwick has no authority over a duke's choice of bride. The word bride hung in the air between them. Flora felt lightheaded. You cannot possibly be proposing marriage. We've met exactly twice. 3 times now, he corrected with unexpected humor. And no, I am not formally proposing tonight. That would indeed be precipitous. I am merely declaring my interest, testing whether you might consider the possibility. Before Flora could formulate a response, Lady Harwick appeared before them, her smile tight with controlled fury. Your Grace, how good of you to entertain Miss Middleton. Cecilia has just mentioned how dearly she would love to show you Lady Pembroke's conservatory. The orchids are particularly fine this season. The Duke rose smoothly. Another time, perhaps. Miss Middleton and I were discussing the remarkable marble used in the Pembroke entrance hall. Limestone, would you say, Miss Middleton? Flora recognized his attempt to maintain their private connection even under Lady Harwick's scrutiny. Carrara marble, I believe, Your Grace. Imported from Italy. Fascinating, Lady Harwick interjected with strained politeness. Miss Middleton, I believe Lydia requires your assistance. With no choice but to obey, Flora rose and curtsied. Your Grace. Thank you for the dance. The pleasure was mine, Miss Middleton. His formal tone did not match the intensity of his gaze. I look forward to continuing our conversation about architectural materials. As Lady Harwick led her away with a grip like iron on her elbow, Flora could feel the weight of the ballroom's attention following them. What game are you playing, Miss Middleton? Lady Harwick hissed once they were relatively private. Do you imagine the Duke has serious intentions toward a penniless companion? Flora met her employer's gaze steadily. I imagine nothing, my lady. His Grace was merely being kind. Kind? Lady Harwick's laugh held no humour. Dukes are not kind to insignificant women without purpose. Either he means to use you to provoke jealousy in some other quarter, or he has dishonourable intentions. Either way, you will not encourage him. The accusation stung, though Flora had expected nothing less. I would never behave inappropriately, my lady. See that you don't. Remember your position and your family's circumstances. The threat was thinly veiled. Now attend to Lydia. She claims her slipper has come loose. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of duty and stolen glances across the crowded ballroom. The Duke danced once with Cecilia, as protocol demanded, but otherwise engaged only with his aunt and several elderly dowagers. Flora noted how he positioned himself throughout the evening to maintain her in his line of sight, though they did not speak again. As the Harwick carriage returned them home, Lady Harwick's displeasure manifested in a stream of criticism directed at Flora's posture, her handling of Lydia's slipper crisis, and finally, her unseemly prominence during the evening. I did not seek the Duke's attention, my lady, Flora said quietly when permitted to speak. I was as surprised as anyone. See that you remain surprised rather than expectant, Lady Harwick snapped. Nothing breeds disappointment faster than misplaced hope. In her small attic room later that night, Flora removed her simple gown and unpinned her hair with trembling fingers. The Duke's words replayed in her mind, wonderful and terrible in equal measure. She was not so naive as to believe a Duke could seriously contemplate marriage to someone of her station, yet something in his earnest gaze had seemed utterly sincere. Foolish girl, she whispered to her reflection. You've built your walls for protection, not to invite scaling. The following morning brought a bouquet of unusual alpine flowers to Harwick House, accompanied by a scholarly treatise on botanical specimens found in limestone regions. The card read simply, for educational purposes. S. Lady Harwick intercepted the delivery, her face thunderous as she burst into the morning room where Flora sat with the girls. What is the meaning of this? She thrust the small volume toward Flora. The Duke sends you gifts now. Flora accepted the book with careful hands. It appears to be a continuation of our discussion on geological formations, my lady. Geological formations. Lady Harwick's voice rose dangerously. Do you take me for a fool, Miss Middleton? The Duke is toying with you, and by extension, with this household. Cecilia looked up from her embroidery, her pretty features twisted with spite. Perhaps he means to make her his mistress, Mamma. Isn't that what happens to companions who get above themselves? Cecilia! Lady Harwick exclaimed, though her expression suggested the thought had already occurred to her. Flora felt the blood drain from her face. I assure you, nothing improper has transpired or will transpire. If you wish, I shall return the book with a note declining further correspondence. Lady Harwick considered this, calculation evident in her narrowed eyes. No. That would insult his Grace, which we cannot afford. You will write a polite note of thanks, which I shall review. Then you will make yourself scarce when he inevitably calls. The Duke clearly enjoys some game of his own devising. We shall neither encourage nor offend until his purpose becomes clear. 3 days later, the Duke's carriage appeared at Harwick House. Lady Harwick immediately sent Flora to the upper floors with instructions to remain there until summoned, while she received the visitor with Cecilia prominently displayed beside her. From her vantage point on the landing, Flora could hear the Duke's deep voice inquiring after her. Miss Middleton is indisposed today, Your Grace, Lady Harwick's voice carried clearly. A headache, I believe. But Cecilia would be delighted to show you the watercolors she recently completed. A lengthy silence followed before the Duke spoke again. Please convey my wishes for Miss Middleton's swift recovery. Another time, perhaps, Miss Harwick. His departure was followed by the sound of something shattering, likely a vase thrown by Lady Harwick in frustration. The pattern repeated over the following week. The Duke called twice more, each time to be told Flora was unavailable. Flowers arrived daily, each selection more unusual than the last, accompanied by notes about their geological habitats. Lady Harwick grew increasingly agitated, torn between fury at Flora and reluctance to offend the Duke. On the 10th day, as Flora sat with Lydia in the garden, a familiar tall figure appeared on the path. Lady Harwick had gone visiting, leaving strict instructions that Flora was to remain out of sight if any callers appeared. "The Duke!" Lydia exclaimed, then giggled. How fortunate Mamma isn't home to marshal Cecilia into position. Flora rose hastily. "Miss Lydia, I should return to the house, nonsense." Lydia's eye sparkled with mischief. "I'm desperate to understand this strange fixation he has with you. Stay and satisfy my curiosity." Before Flora could protest further, the Duke had reached them. He bowed formally to Lydia, then turned to Flora with undisguised relief. "Miss Middleton, I began to fear your indisposition might prove fatal." "Your Grace." Flora curtsied, acutely aware of Lydia's avid interest. "I apologize for my unavailability during your calls." "Unavailability," he repeated with a raised eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling Lady Harwick's determined interference?" Lydia clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, this is better than a novel. Mamma has been hiding you away, Miss Middleton, while positioning Cecilia at every opportunity. Miss Lydia, please." Flora shot her a warning look. The Duke's expression darkened. "I suspected as much. Are you well, Flora?" "Truly." His use of her given name in front of Lydia was shocking enough, but the genuine concern in his voice was even more unsettling. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace," she assured him. "Though perhaps we should not continue this conversation. Lady Harwick would be most displeased." "Lady Harwick is not present," he pointed out. "And Miss Lydia appears to be enjoying the drama unfolding in her garden." Lydia nodded enthusiastically. "Immensely, Your Grace. Though I admit I don't understand your interest in our dull Miss Middleton when my sister is considered a diamond of the season." "Lydia!" Flora exclaimed, mortified. The Duke, however, seemed amused by the girl's frankness. "Beauty without substance holds little appeal for me, Miss Lydia. I find I prefer depth of character to perfection of features." "How unconventional," Lydia remarked. "No wonder Mamma is in such a state." The sound of carriage wheels on the drive interrupted their conversation. Lady Harwick was returning earlier than expected. "You must go," Flora urged the Duke. "If Lady Harwick finds you here with me, what will she do?" "Dismiss you." His voice hardened. "Let her try." "Please." Flora's voice dropped to a whisper. "She will make my position untenable. I cannot afford to lose this place." Something in her plea reached him. He nodded curtly. "Very well. But this situation cannot continue indefinitely, Flora." He turned to Lydia with a formal bow. "Miss Lydia, a pleasure as always. Perhaps you might escort me to the front gate by a path that avoids your mother's notice." Lydia, thrilled to be party to such intrigue, readily agreed. As they departed, the Duke glanced back once, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination that left Flora both fearful and strangely exhilarated. Lady Harwick was indeed in a state when she entered the garden moments later. "There you are, Miss Middleton. I've just passed the Duke's carriage on the road. Has he called while I was absent?" "I believe he may have stopped briefly to pay his respects to Miss Lydia," Flora answered carefully. "They were walking toward the gate as you arrived." Lady Harwick's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And where were you during this visit?" "Right here, my lady," reading to Miss Lydia until she saw his grace approaching. It wasn't precisely a lie, though the omission hung heavy in Flora's conscience. Lady Harwick seemed satisfied, however, and moved on to criticizing the gardener's handling of the rose bushes. That evening, as Flora prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Lydia in her nightgown, eyes bright with excitement. "The Duke left something for you," she whispered, pressing a folded note into Flora's hand. "He gave it to me when Mama couldn't see." "Isn't it thrilling?" "Like something from a romantic novel." Flora accepted the note with trepidation. "This is most improper, Miss Lydia." "If your mother discovered, she won't," Lydia assured her. "I can keep secrets when they're interesting enough. And this is the most interesting thing to happen at Harwick House in years." She turned to go, then paused. "He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama before they grew tired of each other. It's rather beautiful, actually." After Lydia departed, Flora unfolded the note with trembling fingers. "Flora, Lady Harwick's interference forces my hand sooner than I intended. I will not have you treated as a prisoner because of my interest. My aunt hosts a small musical evening tomorrow at Saleborn House. I have sent a formal invitation to the Harwicks, which Lady Harwick cannot reasonably decline given my aunt's social position. Ensure you accompany the family. We will speak privately then. Yours." Maxwell. Flora pressed the note to her chest, equal parts thrilled and terrified. The Duke was forcing a confrontation, and she could not imagine it ending well for her position at Harwick House. True to his word, the invitation arrived the following morning. Lady Harwick was beside herself with triumph, certain the Duke's interest in Cecilia was finally manifesting in a proper social invitation. "You shall wear the blue silk, Cecilia, with the pearl choker," she instructed. "Lydia, the pink muslin will do for you." She turned to Flora with a critical eye. "Miss Middleton, you will wear your grey gown and remain inconspicuous. Should the Duke acknowledge you, you will be brief and direct his attention towards Cecilia whenever possible." "Yes, my lady," Flora agreed, the note hidden in her pocket feeling like a burning coal against her skin. Saleborn House blazed with light as their carriage approached the following evening. Though described as a small musical evening, the gathering included some 40 of London's elite, all curious about the reclusive Duke's sudden return to society. Lady Saleborn greeted them warmly, her shrewd eyes lingering on Flora with undisguised interest. "Miss Middleton, how lovely to see you again. My nephew mentioned you have an appreciation for Bach. I've ensured the program includes several of his compositions." Lady Harwick's smile froze at this obvious sign of the Duke's continued interest in Flora. "How considerate, Lady Saleborn. Cecilia is particularly fond of musical evenings, aren't you, my dear?" As the evening progressed, Flora maintained her position slightly apart from the main gathering, observing the familiar social patterns with detached interest. The Duke moved among his guests with formal courtesy, though his gaze frequently sought her across the room. During the musical performance, Flora found herself seated in the last row, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. As the violinist began a haunting Bach sonata, she became aware of a presence beside her. The Duke had silently taken the empty chair, his tall frame angled toward her. "You received my note," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the music. Flora kept her gaze fixed forward. Yes. Though I fear your strategy has only intensified Lady Harwick's determination. Her determination is irrelevant. His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the chair arm, hidden from view by the flowers. Mine, however, is absolute. The warmth of his touch sent a tremor through her. This is madness, Maxwell. You know it cannot end well. On the contrary. His fingers tightened gently around hers. I believe it can end very well indeed. If you'll permit me to demonstrate. Before she could respond, the piece concluded and polite applause filled the room. The Duke released her hand and rose smoothly, moving away before Lady Harwick could notice their proximity. As the musical portion of the evening concluded, guests moved toward the refreshment room. Flora found herself momentarily alone near a partially open door to the library. A hand emerged from the shadows, catching her wrist gently. A moment, if you would, the Duke's voice came low and urgent. Against her better judgment, Flora allowed him to draw her into the library. He closed the door partially, leaving it open enough to maintain propriety while affording them a measure of privacy. This is most improper, she protested, though she made no move to leave. Propriety has its place, he acknowledged, but not when it prevents necessary conversation. He paced briefly before turning to face her directly. I can no longer tolerate Lady Harwick's interference. Nor can I bear to see you treated as though your feelings are inconsequential. Flora clasped her hands tightly before her. My position doesn't allow for feelings, Maxwell. Then perhaps it's time to consider a change of position. He moved closer, his expression earnest. I've spoken to my solicitor. Your father's debts, the ones that drove him to his desperate act, they can be resolved. Your mother could be comfortably established. You would never again be dependent on the whims of employers like Lady Harwick. Flora stared at him in shock. You investigated my family's circumstances. I needed to understand the chains that bind you. He reached for her hands, which she allowed him to take after a moment's hesitation. Flora, I meant what I said at the Pembroke ball. There's something in your quiet strength that calls to me. I've spent 3 years hiding from the world after Eliza's betrayal, convinced I would never trust again. Yet I find I trust you implicitly. You hardly know me, she whispered, repeating her objection from their previous conversation. I know enough, he insisted. The rest we can discover together. Flora withdrew her hands gently. What exactly are you proposing, Maxwell? Marriage. The word hung in the air between them. A true partnership, not the loveless arrangement society expects of my position. You can't possibly, I can and I do. His certainty was unshakable. Society will gossip, of course. The Duke who married a companion with a tainted family name will provide weeks of entertainment. But society always finds something new to discuss eventually, and I find I care nothing for their opinions. Flora turned away, overwhelmed. This is too sudden. Too impulsive. Is it? He didn't touch her, though she could feel him standing close behind her. Or is it perhaps the most considered decision I've made in years? After Eliza, I vowed never to be swayed by beauty or charm again. Instead, I find myself drawn to your intellect, your resilience, your quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that would break a lesser spirit. She faced him again, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity. And if I refuse? If I believe this infatuation will pass once the novelty wears thin? Then I would respect your decision, he said simply. I would ensure your mother's comfort regardless, and find you a more suitable position away from Lady Harwick's pettiness. But I would also spend considerable time attempting to change your mind. A smile tugged at Flora's lips despite her turmoil. You are remarkably persistent, Your Grace. Maxwell, he corrected, his own smile emerging. And yes, persistence is a family trait. My father courted my mother for 3 seasons before she accepted him. 3 seasons. Flora raised an eyebrow. I hope you don't expect similar resistance from me. Then you're considering acceptance. Hope brightened his features. Before she could answer, the library door swung fully open. Lady Harwick stood in the doorway, her expression thunderous as she took in their proximity. Miss Middleton! What is the meaning of this outrageous behavior? She demanded, voice shaking with fury. In a private room with His Grace, have you no sense of propriety whatsoever? The Duke straightened to his full height, his manner instantly transforming from earnest suitor to imposing aristocrat. The impropriety is yours, Lady Harwick, in bursting into a private conversation without announcement. Private conversation? Lady Harwick's laugh was brittle. Is that what we're calling it? A duke doesn't seek private conversation with a paid companion unless his intentions are dishonourable. My intentions, the Duke said coldly, are entirely honourable, I assure you. In fact, they could not be more so. Lady Harwick's eyes widened as his meaning registered. Surely you cannot be suggesting, I have asked Miss Middleton to become my wife, he confirmed, his tone brooking no argument. A request you have unfortunately interrupted before I could receive her answer. Lady Harwick turned to Flora, disbelief warring with calculation in her expression. This is absurd. Miss Middleton, you cannot possibly entertain such a notion. Think of your position, your family's disgrace. You are not fit to be a duchess. The word struck Flora with physical force, voicing her deepest insecurities. Yet something in the Duke's steady gaze gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. My father's mistakes are not my own, Lady Harwick, she said quietly. Nor does my current position define my character or capabilities. The Duke's expression filled with such pride at her response that Flora felt a surge of confidence. Lady Harwick was not so easily silenced. You would be a laughingstock, Your Grace. Society would never accept such a misalliance. Society will do as I dictate, he replied with aristocratic assurance. The tongue has short memories when it suits them, and longer purses often dictate the length of those memories. Lady Selborne appeared in the doorway behind Lady Harwick, taking in the tableau with shrewd understanding. Is there a problem, Lady Harwick? I do hope you're not distressing my nephews intended. Intended? Lady Harwick spluttered. Lady Selborne, surely you cannot approve of this farce. On the contrary. Lady Selborne moved into the room with regal composure. I have spent 3 years watching my nephew retreat from life after a cruel betrayal by a woman who loved his title more than the man. Miss Middleton, with her quiet intelligence and genuine character, is precisely what he needs. She turned to Flora with a gentle smile. That is, if she accepts him. All eyes turned to Flora, who stood momentarily frozen by the sudden demand for her answer. I? She looked from Lady Harwick's outrage to Lady Selborne's encouragement, finally settling on the Duke's face, where vulnerability had replaced his aristocratic mask. In that moment, seeing past the title to the man who had recognized her worth when others saw only her circumstances, Flora found her answer. Yes, she said softly, then with more conviction. Yes, I accept. The Duke's face transformed with such joy that Flora felt her heart might burst. Lady Selborne clapped her hands in delight, while Lady Harwick seemed struck speechless. Well, Lady Selborne declared brightly, I believe a formal announcement is in order. Lady Harwick, shall we return to the gathering? I'm sure you'll want to congratulate your former companion properly once you've had time to absorb the news. With remarkable efficiency, Lady Saleborn ushered the still-stunned Lady Harwick from the library, closing the door behind them to give the newly engaged couple a moment of privacy. Flora. The Duke, Maxwell, took her hands in his. "You've made me happier than I believed possible again. I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't a dream," she admitted. "Or that you won't regret your impulsiveness when you face society's reaction. The only regret I might have had would be losing you to fear of opinion." He raised her hand to his lips. "Society scorned you for your quiet ways. I cherish you for your silent strength. That is the only truth that matters." As he drew her gently into his embrace, Flora finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness she had long ago resigned herself to never experiencing. The walls she had built for protection had not kept him out, but rather shown him the true value of what lay within. And when they returned to the gathering, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the whispers and stares held no power to wound her. For in the Duke's steady gaze, she had found not just love, but recognition of her worth that no society gossip could diminish. 6 months later, as Flora Saleborn, Duchess of Saleborn, stood in the grand entrance hall of their London home greeting guests for her first formal reception, she caught her husband watching her from across the room. His smile, warm and private despite the crowd, conveyed a world of meaning they now shared. Society had indeed gossiped, then gradually accepted, and finally admired the Duke's unconventional choice. For Flora had proven that quiet dignity and intelligence could command respect as effectively as beauty or fortune, especially when supported by the unwavering devotion of one of England's most powerful dukes. In the quiet moments they shared away from society's eyes, Maxwell often told her that her silence had spoken to him more eloquently than all the practiced charm he had endured in ballrooms and drawing rooms. And Flora, who had once believed her reserved nature a liability, discovered that being valued precisely for who she was represented the greatest freedom she had ever known.